Welcome back to PALS TV, everyone. We'll be doing our lunch hour segment now and actually heading over to Columbus to do our weekly book club with Professor Phil and continuing from where we left off last week and reading Don Quixote. But today we've been talking about some history in each segment, and we spoke about some of the history in Steubenville and Gallia. Obviously, Columbus is rich with history as it is our state capital, but it wasn't always our state capital. I think that's what's interesting about Columbus. Our first state capital was actually in Chillicothe, Ohio. Once we became the 17th state, in 1803, March 1st, we named Chillicothe as our first state capital. And it remained a state capital until 1810, when we wanted a bigger influence over an eastern part of the state. So Zanesville then became the capital, and went right back to Chillicothe in 1812 for a very short time, because in 1812, Ohio decided to create basically Columbus as its capital, and actually emancipated it in 1816, and that's when it became the capital of our state. So in 1816, Columbus became the official state capital of Ohio. Some famous people from Columbus, really is mostly entertainment when it comes to famous people, but Beverly D'Angelo is a big one from National Lampoons. If you remember the mom in a lot of the shows, she was from the city of Columbus. Rascal Flatts, the band, is from Columbus. If you're a Food Network fan, Diners, Drive-Ins, and Dives with Guy Fieri, he is actually from Columbus, Ohio as well. Me, I'm an animal guy. Jack Hanna, we're very proud to have Jack Hanna and what he has done in preserving our animal kingdom. He is a huge influence and has just done an incredible job and really just raising awareness to those sorts of things. Some influential sports figures, Buster Douglas, who upset Mike Tyson, was from Columbus, and Jack Nicklaus, who is one of the, I guess, greatest golfers of all time, actually was from Columbus, Ohio as well. So we've been talking about a lot of history. Obviously, Don Quixote really plays into history in this century and where we are today in our modern day novels and where we came from and that Spanish influence. So we really appreciate Phil, sharing Don Quixote with us, and we're really looking forward to what we built off of from last week. So live from Columbus, Ohio, Professor Phil, bring us Don Quixote.
Good afternoon, team. And as long as we're on people from the Columbus area and history, don't forget the Clooneys, Rosemary and George from Upper Arlington. Rosemary Clooney almost certainly sang some of the songs from Man of La Mancha. She is one of the greatest jazz standard singers there is. All right. So happy Revenge of the 5th to everybody. Good to see you all here today. We're going to start on the second chapter of Don Quixote today. Let's do a quick recap of what's happened so far in our story. So as we hopefully recall, if you were here last week, Don Quixote is a reasonably well off, not quite rich, but he's doing okay for himself, nobleman in Spain. This is long after the time of the knights and things like that, but that's what he loves reading about those, loves those stories. And Cervantes, the author, is not a big fan of those stories. So what happens to Don Quixote, because he reads those stories, is he starts to lose it a little bit and decides that he's going to become a knight and run around on a horse with a lance and start beating up the bad guys. So he gets some old armor that's been lying around in his house, puts together a helmet, which is mostly cardboard, gets his old beat up horse out, gives it a fancy name, gives himself a fancy name, and that's why we call him Don Quixote. That's just his made up name. And now he's about to go out and see the world and do what he believes that knights do. Let me pull up our story here. All right. If anybody has any questions or anything, feel free to wave a hand. I'm going to do my best to see everybody, but it's a little tough because I got to read this at the same time. We will be reading one sentence at a time. First of all, this is written in Spanish originally, and it changes in the types of Spanish, so some of it's really old. So when people translate this into English, they tend to follow that style. So some of it's kind of weird and complex, but as we go through, I'll explain it sentence by sentence so we know what's going on. All right, are we sitting comfortably? Then let's begin. Chapter 2. These preliminaries settled, he did not care to put off any longer the execution of his design, urged on to it by the thought of all the world was losing by his delay, seeing what wrongs he intended to right, grievances to redress, injustices to repair, abuses to remove, and duties to discharge. So Don Quixote has his plan. He's going to go be a knight. He's going to beat up the bad guys. He's going to uplift the downtrodden. He's going to feed the hungry and house the homeless, protect those who need protecting. It's a scary world out there, and he can't wait. He needs to get out there and do that right away. So, without giving notice of intention to anyone, and without anybody seeing him, one morning before the dawning of the day, which was one of the hottest of the month of July, he donned a suit of armor, mounted Rocinante with his patched up helmet on, braced his buckler, took his lance, and by the back door of the yard, sallied forth upon the plain in the highest contentment and satisfaction at seeing with what ease he had made a beginning with his grand purpose. So he's got his plan. He doesn't tell anybody, just jumps on his horse, has his armor on, grabs his shield and his lance, and takes off out the back door. But scarcely did he find, oh, that's not going. But scarcely did he find himself upon the open plain when a terrible thought struck him, one all but enough to make him abandon the enterprise at the very outset. So he's taken off, running across the field out back, and he thinks of something horrible, and he's like, whoa, I gotta slow down here. It occurred to him that he had not yet been dubbed a knight, and that according to the law of chivalry, he neither could nor ought to bear arms against any knight, and that even if he had been, still he ought, as a novice knight, to wear white armor, without a device upon the shield, until by his prowess he had earned one. So there are rules for knighthood, and there are to this day. There are many countries that still have knights. And you can't just call yourself a knight and then go out and do stuff. You have to be made a knight by someone in charge, someone with authority. So he needs to get that done, otherwise what he does won't count. And if you're a knight and you're new, in Spain at least, on your shield, you would normally have a coat of arms that tells everybody who you are. You wear a helmet so they can't see you. So you wear a picture on your shield so they, oh no, that's Don Quixote. Or that's Dame Gila over there. So a new knight, in Spain at least, would wear white armor and nothing on their shield until they had made a name for themselves and had something they could put on, because your symbol there would tell part of your story. These reflections made him waver in his purpose, but his craze being stronger than any reasoning, he made up his mind to have himself dubbed a knight by the first one he came across, following the example of others in the same case, as he had read in the books that brought him to this pass. So I said, well, I'm not a knight yet, but another knight can make me a knight. So as soon as I run into one, I'll have them do it. But I'll just go out and do it. As for white armor, he resolved, on the first opportunity, to scour his until it was whiter than an ermine, and so comforting himself, he pursued his way, taking that which his horse chose, for in this he believed lay the essence of adventures. I said, well, my armor's not white, but if I scrub it really good, it'll turn white. It'll be so white, it'll be like an ermine, which is just a white weasel. People use their fur to make coats with. If you see somebody with a great big fur coat, it is very often supposed to be ermine. And he decides, I'm just going to let the horse decide where we're going. Horse figures it out, and wherever the horse goes, that's where the fun stuff will happen. That's where I can go and right wrongs. Thus setting out, our new-fledged adventurer paced along, talking to himself and saying, who knows but that in time to come, when the veracious history of my famous deeds is made known, the sage who writes it, when he has to set forth my first sally in the early morning, will do it after this fashion. So he says, I don't even know when they tell my story, because I'm going to be a very famous knight, that the people that write my story in the future, are they really going to get this part right? Nobody has any idea. Scarce had the rubicund Apollo spread o'er the face of the broad spacious earth the golden threads of his bright hair. Scarce had the little birds of painted plumage attuned their notes to hail with dulcet and mellifluous harmony the coming of the rosy dawn, that, deserting the soft couch of her jealous spouse, was appearing to mortals at the gates and balconies of the Manchegan horizon, when the renowned knight Don Quixote of La Mancha, quitting the lazy down, mounted his celebrated steed Rocinante, and began to traverse the ancient and famous Campo de Montiel. That's what Don Quixote thinks is the correct thing that happened. That's what the sage should write. You know, this is weird and fancy language. This is the sort of language that the books that he read were in. There are a lot of different references in this story to classical Greek literature as well as the night stories. But mostly what he's saying is the sun just popped up. That is Apollo in the Greek. Sun's just popped up and the birds have started singing. It's early in the morning and Don Quixote, me, is taken off and going to go see what's out there. Which in fact, he was actually traversing. That is the Campo de Montiel. Happy the age, happy the time, he continued, in which shall be made known my deeds of fame, worthy to be molded in brass, carved in marble, limned in pictures, for a memorial forever. Not only are they going to tell his story, but they're going to build statues to him. They're going to draw pictures, really fancy ones with lots of color. They're going to make brass figurines and write down everything that he's done. And thou, O sage magician, whoever thou art, to whom it shall fall to be the chronicler of this wondrous history, forget not, I entreat thee, my good Rocinante, the constant companion of my ways and wanderings. Now Don Quixote's talking aloud to the non-existent writer who's going to write down everything that he does. He says, I'm going to be famous, and you're going to write all the good, cool things that I do, but don't forget my horse, because my horse is important. Bring that up a bit. Presently, he broke out again, as if he were love-stricken in earnest. O Princess Dulcinea, lady of this captive heart, a grievous wrong hast thou done me to drive me forth with scorn, and with inexorable obduracy banish me from the presence of thy beauty. So if you remember from the first chapter, Dulcinea is the name that he came up with for the girl that he used to like when he was younger. It's not her real name. He just thinks that sounds fancy. And he's saying to the world in general out loud, even though he's alone with his horse, talking to her and saying, oh, you told me we couldn't go out, and that's pretty rough. And the real sad thing is, you're so pretty that I don't get to see you. And that's really upsetting. O lady, deign to hold in remembrance this heart, thy vassal, that thus in anguish pines for love of thee. And again, he's still talking in this weird, fancy language that doesn't make sense to anybody. But he's saying that I know you won't go out with me, but remember that I'm the one that loves you, and everything I'm doing out here, beating up the bad guys, having adventures, this is all for you. Grab that. So he went on, stringing together these and other absurdities, all in the style of those his books had taught him, imitating their language as well he could. And all the while he rode so slowly, and the sun mounted so rapidly, and with such fervor, that it was enough to melt his brains if he had any. Again, our author, Cervantes, is not a big fan of what Don Quixote's doing. So he's saying he's just kind of wandering around on the horse, just talking to himself in this fancy language, and it's getting so hot on his helmet that it's making him all crazy. He can't think of anything. Nearly all day he traveled without anything remarkable happening to him, at which he was in despair, for he was anxious to encounter someone at once upon whom to try the might of his strong arm. So he goes through the entire day and doesn't see anybody the whole day. And he's kind of upset about that because he wants to make himself a famous knight. And to do that, he's got to beat up the bad guys. Hasn't run into any bad guys yet. Writers there are who say the first adventure he met with was that of Puerto La Peach. Others say it was that of the windmills. But what I have ascertained on this point, and what I have found written in the annals of La Mancha, is that he was on the road all day, and towards nightfall, his hack and he found themselves dead tired and hungry, when, looking all around to see if he could discover any castle or shepherd's shanty where he might refresh himself and relieve his sore wants, he perceived not far out of his road an inn, which was as welcome as a star guiding him to the portals, if not the palaces, of his redemption. And quickening his pace, he reached it just as night was settling in. So Cervantes is telling us that other people who tell the story of Don Quixote kind of get it out of order, and they say something happened that first day. Well, I checked it out. Nothing happened that first day. He just went all day, and he and the horse were tired, and they were hungry, and just sore from riding all day. So now, oh look, there's an inn. I'm going to go and see if I can get myself a place to sleep for the night, to relax, maybe a bite to eat. At the door were standing two young women, girls of the district, as they call them, on their way to Seville, with some carriers who had chanced to halt that night at the inn. And, as happen what might to our adventurer, everything he saw or imagined seemed to him to be and to happen after the fashion of what he read of. The moment he saw the inn, he pictured it to himself as a castle with its 4 turrets and pinnacles of shining silver, not forgetting the drawbridge and moat and all the belongings usually ascribed to castles of this sort. So Don Quixote sees this just an inn, like a motel, basically. But because he's all crazy about these stories, he thinks it's one of the castles from his stories. So the people he sees there are members of the castle and the traders there, people traveling goods, truckers these days, but they had carts and horses then, and the serving women there. He thinks those are all going to be people that work and live in a castle and work for some person in charge of the castle, whether that's a king or what. To this inn, which to him seemed a castle, he advanced, and at a short distance from it, he checked Rocinante, hoping that some dwarf would show himself upon the battlements, and by sound of trumpet, give notice that a knight was approaching the castle. So before he rides up to the inn, but before he gets there, he stops because he thinks somebody needs to come out, blow a trumpet, and tell the castle, hey, here's Don Quixote, the not famous knight yet. He's coming into the castle, let everybody know. But seeing that they were slow about it, and that Rocinante was in a hurry to reach the stable, he made for the inn door, and perceived the two gay damsels who were standing there, and who seemed to him to be two fair maidens, or lovely ladies, taking their ease at the castle gate. Nobody comes out to greet him, because that's not what happens at an inn, just at a castle. But the horse is tired, and the horse does not believe this is a castle. The horse is trying to get into the stable. Besides, I'll just go and do what the horse wants, and I'll just head on in. At this moment, it so happened that a swineherd who was going through the stubbles collecting a drove of pigs, for without any apology, that is what they are called, gave a blast of his horn to bring them together, and forthwith it seemed to Don Quixote to be what he was expecting, the signal of some dwarf announcing his arrival. And so, with prodigious satisfaction, he rode up to the inn and to the ladies, who, seeing a man of this sort approaching in full armor and with lance and buckler, were turning in dismay into the inn, when Don Quixote, guessing their fear by their flight, raising his pasteboard visor, disclosed his dry, dusty visage, and with courteous bearing and gentle voice addressed them. So there's a guy with some pigs, and he's trying to get his pigs all together. They're outside the inn, and he blows a horn to get the pigs to come near him. I don't know if that actually works for pigs, but that's what he was trying. Don Quixote thinks that's the trumpet that is announcing him into the castle. And so he rides up, and there are the two women standing there. And they think, oh, here's some crazy guy wearing armor and carrying weapons. We're going to head inside. And he said, oh, no, don't be afraid. And then he says to them, your ladyships need not fly or fear any rudeness, for that it belongs not to the order of knighthood which I profess to offer to anyone, much less to high-born maidens as your appearance proclaims you to be. Says, don't worry, ladies, I'm not going to be mean or rude to you or hurt you in any way. I wouldn't do that to anybody because I'm a knight, and I certainly wouldn't do it to fancy noble women such as yourselves. The girls were looking at him and straining their eyes to make out the features which the clumsy visor obscured. But when they heard themselves called maidens, a thing so much out of their line that they could not restrain their laughter, which made Don Quixote wax indignant and say, modesty becomes the fair, and moreover, laughter that has little cause is great silliness. This, however, I say not to pain or anger you, for my desire is none other than to serve you. So they hear this nonsense that Don Quixote is saying. Clearly, they're not noble women. So they start laughing at him. It's a ridiculous thing to say. He says, hey, you can't just be laughing for no reason. He doesn't understand they're laughing at him because what he says doesn't make any sense to them. He thinks it makes sense. He says, I'm not trying to upset you by telling you you can't laugh at nothing and you sound ridiculous. I just want to let you know that. But I'm here to work for you. The incomprehensible language and the unpromising looks of our cavalier only increased the lady's laughter, and that increased his irritation, and matters might have gone farther if at that moment the landlord had not come out, who, being a very fat man, was a very peaceful one. So he says this nonsense to them and says it in this fancy language that nobody understands, and they start laughing at him more. He's like, you shouldn't be laughing at me, getting more upset. But then out comes the landlord, the guy that owns the inn. He's going to set things to right. Yeah, a bit anyway. He, seeing this grotesque figure, clad in armor that did not match any more than his saddle, bridle, lance, buckler, or corselet, was not at all indisposed to join the damsels in their manifestation of amusement. But in truth, Standing in awe of such a complicated armament, he thought it best to speak him fairly. So he said, Senor Caballero, if your worship wants lodging, baiting the bed, for there is not one in the inn, there is plenty of everything else here. So the innkeeper sees Don Quixote in this ridiculous armor that he has, and he says, this isn't something to laugh at. Clearly this guy thinks he's a knight. So he says, Senor Caballero, which means knight at that time. If you want a place to stay, you can stay here in the inn. We've got everything except a bed. We don't have any beds in the inn, but we got everything else you could possibly want in an inn. Don Quixote, observing the respectful bearing of the alcalde of the fortress, for so innkeeper and inn seemed in his eyes, made answer, Sir Castellan, for me anything will suffice, for my armor's only wear is my only wear, my only rest is the fray. Again, this Don Quixote talking his weird fancy language, but he doesn't think it's an innkeeper because he doesn't think it's an inn. He thinks it's a castle, and he thinks this is the guy in charge of the castle, a castellan. And so he quotes one of the old stories that he likes. And what he says is, I'm not really concerned about the bed. Anything you give me will be good, because the only thing I ever wear is armor. That's the only clothes I get. I don't get fancy stuff. And the only time I feel rested and relaxed is when I'm fighting bad guys. The host fancied he called him Castellan because he took him for a worthy of Castile, though he was in fact an Andalusian, and one from the Saint of Sanlúcar, as crafty as a thief as Caucasus, and as full of tricks as a student or a page. This is a bit of Cervantes' racism here, basically. The innkeeper doesn't think that he's being called Castellan because he's somebody in charge of a castle, which is what Don Quixote means. He thinks it's because Don Quixote thinks the innkeeper's from Castile, which is a region in Spain. He's actually from a different region, and then Cervantes says some really nasty things about those people, the Andalusians from that area where the innkeeper's from, and says they're tricky people and they're kind of mean and like to screw around with people. So then the innkeeper says, in that case, said he, your bed is on the flinty rock, your sleep to watch alway. And if so, you may dismount and safely reckon upon any quantity of sleeplessness under this roof for a 12-month, not to say for a single night. So the innkeeper starts messing with Don Quixote. Says, if that quote that you're saying is true, then you can just sleep on the rock, and instead of sleeping, you can just stay up all night. And if you're fine with that, I won't let you just stay here tonight at the inn. You can stay here for an entire year. So saying, he advanced to hold the stirrup for Don Quixote, who got down with great difficulty and exertion, for he had not broken his fast all day, and then charged the host to take great care of his horse, as he was the best bit of flesh that ever ate bread in this world. So the innkeeper comes up and is helping Don Quixote off the horse, and it's taken some work for Don Quixote to get off this horse. He is beat up, he is tired, and he hadn't eaten all day. When he gets down, he says, and God, you got to take care of my horse. This is a great horse. And as you remember, the horse is not a great horse. That is a beat-up old horse. The landlord eyed him over, but did not find him as good as Don Quixote said, nor even half as good. And putting him up in the stable, he returned to see what might be wanted by his guest, whom the damsels, who had by this time made their peace with him, were now relieving him of his armor. So the innkeeper takes the horse, put him in the stable, and says, this is not that good a horse. And after he puts Rocinante in the stable, he comes back out, and the girls have stopped laughing at Don Quixote, and they're helping him out of his armor. Armor weighs a lot, and you wear it all day, especially riding when you got to move and hold yourself up on that horse. You're just sore and beat down. A little further down. There we go. They'd taken off his breastplate and backpiece, but they neither knew nor saw how to open his gorget or remove his makeshift helmet, for he'd fastened it with green ribbons, which, as there was no untying the knots, required to be cut. So they've taken off the front and the back of his armor, but they can't figure out his helmet, because it's a little bit of metal on the top and some cardboard, and he's tied it all together with ribbons so it'll stay on his head and stay together. But he tied him real tight. He's not real good at making knots, so they have to cut those knots instead of untying them. But he ain't going to let that happen, as we see here. This, however, he would not by any means consent to, so he remained all the evening with his helmet on, the drollest and oddest figure that can be imagined. And while they were removing his armor, taking the baggages who were about it for ladies of high degree belonging to the castle, he said to them with great sprightliness, we'll pause a second to describe that before we get to what he said. He's not going to let him cut those ribbons. That's his armor. So he just stays the whole night wearing this helmet out of metal and cardboard and ribbon, and everybody thinks that this looks ridiculous. And they're going and taking his stuff, moving it off, and he says to them, again in the weird fancy language that he likes, "Oh, never, surely was there knight, so served by hand of dame, as served was he, Don Quixote hight, when from his town he came, with maidens waiting on himself, princesses on his hack, or Rocinante, for that lady's mine, is my horse's name, and Don Quixote of La Mancha is my own. But I had no intention of declaring myself until my achievements in your service and honor had made me known, the necessity of adapting that old ballad of Lancelot to the present occasion has given you the knowledge of my name altogether prematurely." Again, this is Don Quixote's weird fancy language that these girls don't understand and nobody around him does. He's saying, nobody in all of history has ever been helped by people as kind as you. You're being really handy and helping me off with my armor, and it's great. And everybody's being nice to my horse. He tells him his horse's name, and then he tells them his own name, Don Quixote of La Mancha. Except he probably shouldn't have said that. Remember, he's supposed to be wearing white armor and a white shield because he hasn't earned a name yet. He hasn't done any famous deeds. He says, well, this is a little early to be telling you this, but I'm going to go ahead and say it. The time, however, will come for your ladyships to command and me to obey, and then the might of my arm will show you my desire to serve you. Because don't worry, pretty soon you're going to want me to do something, and I will happily do it, and you'll see what a great knight I am and how strong I am, and that will let you know how much I want to work for you and do what you say. The girls, who were not used to hearing rhetoric of this sort, had nothing to say in reply. They only asked him if he wanted anything to eat. They have no idea what he is talking about. None of what he said makes any sense to them. So they're just going to ignore what he said and said, well, are you hungry? Well, that's what we do here. We're the serving people. You want something to eat. And he says, I would gladly eat a bit of something, said Don Quixote, for I feel it would come very seasonably. He says, oh yeah, I'm starving. I haven't eaten anything all day. I've been riding this horse. Yeah, bring me some food. That'd be great. The day happened to be a Friday, and in the whole inn there was nothing but some pieces of the fish they call in Castile abadejo, in Andalusia bacalhau, and in some places corradillo, and in others troutlet. So they asked him if he thought he could eat troutlet, for there were no other fish to give him. So at this time, Spain, where they're at, is very strongly Catholic. And since it's a Friday, they can't eat meat, and they have to eat fish in the inn and in all the other Catholic countries. So There's not a lot of food, but they've got trout. If you want a little bit of trout, we've got that. If there be, start highlighting. If there be troutlets enough, said Don Quixote, they will be the same thing as a trout. For it is all one to me, whether I am given 8 reals in small change or a piece of 8. Moreover, it may be that these troutlets are like veal, which is better than beef, or kid, which is better than goat. The troutlets are just little baby trouts. He says, well, I'd like a whole big trout, but, give me the baby ones. That's great. Maybe it's like other stuff where when you eat a younger animal, it tastes better. But whatever it be, let it come quickly, for the burden pressure of arms cannot be borne without support to the inside. I don't care what you feed me, just get it quick, because I am really hungry, been wearing this armor all day. They laid a table for him at the door of the inn, for the sake of the air, and the host brought him a portion of ill-soaked and worse-cooked stockfish, and a piece of bread as black and moldy as his own armor. But a laughable sight it was to see him eating, for having his helmet on and the beaver up, he could not with his own hands put anything into his mouth, unless someone else placed it there, and this service one of the ladies rendered him. So he's got this helmet visor hanging over him. He's got to hold it up with his hands so he can't put food in his own mouth. So he gets some not very good fish and some old beat up bread, and the serving women are just going to put it in his mouth for him, and he'll just chew it. And that looks pretty funny. But to give him anything to drink was impossible, or would have been, had not the landlord bored a reed, and putting one end in his mouth, poured the wine into him through the other, all which he bore with patience, rather than sever the ribbons of his helmet. Well, he's holding up this helmet, and he can't move his head back, because it blocks in the back there. So the innkeeper says, I'll just make a straw. I find this little reed, basically a straw, wood. Make sure it's got holes in it, and we'll just let you suck through that. And Don Quixote's fine with that, because he is not cutting those ribbons. All right, we're part way through chapter 2, and we're coming to the end of our time. So this is Don Quixote. He's run to his first night, the end of his first day as a knight, and he's at the end, and everybody's laughing at him because he looks ridiculous. If you would like, just jump in the chat and send Jonah a message that you would like a copy of this story so that you could read it on your own. And apart from that, anybody have any questions or anything, wave your hand. Okay, we'll see you next time. Over to you, Aaron.
Thank you, Phil. Always appreciate your narrating of Don Quixote and going into the descriptions. It's very helpful to get that point of view and truly understand what they're talking about in certain segments of that book. So thank you. Again, live from Columbus. That was our book club segment with Professor Phil. I'm always enjoy it each week. So we'll be picking up where we left off again next week.